And welcome to a video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade American history class. The purpose of this video lecture is we're going to be looking at the differences between primary and secondary sources. Kind of our guiding question is, how do we as historians know about history? How do we know about what happened a long time ago? So let's find out some of the tools and resources that historians use to learn about the past. Now, some working definitions today are primary sources and secondary sources. A primary source is a first-hand account or record or piece of evidence about a person, a place, object, or maybe an event. When you're thinking about primary sources, think of the item of somebody that was actually at the place or at that event in historical time. A secondary source is really an account or a record or evidence that comes from that primary source. So you want to think of secondary sources of something that somebody wrote about it later on in time. So I heard or I learned about it from somebody who was there, and so I'm summarizing for you what happened. So let's break down what makes something a secondary source. So again, a secondary source is an account, a record, or evidence that comes from an original or primary source. You want to think, I heard or I learned about it from somebody who was actually there. I was not there. Either it happened so long ago that I wasn't around, but I've looked at those accounts from those people who were there, and I've put together a little bit of a summary of what I think might have happened. Now, in American history, and in most of the classes that we take in school, one of the largest examples of a secondary source is probably going to be your United States history textbook. You know, historians write these textbooks for these textbook companies to be used in an educational setting, and they have extensive research of the events that we talk about in our class. They have analyzed those firsthand accounts, those primary source documents, and then they've kind of put together a kind of consensus summary of what they think happened. So if we look at our U.S. history textbook, right, very big, very thick, those are just really full of summaries written by historians of what they think might have happened. Other examples of secondary sources might be other types of books, not textbooks, what we might know as nonfiction books. Oftentimes, many historians won't just write textbooks, they'll write books that you can go purchase at a bookstore or go to your local library and pick up, where they're writing about these historical places and events and people. Oftentimes, biographies, encyclopedias, or historical nonfiction books are all examples of secondary sources. So the next time you're in a library or our library at our school, you might want to check out some of these nonfiction titles, and they're an example of a secondary source. They're a summary that summarizes about historical events and places. Documentaries, movies, are another way that we can access history as a secondary source. Throughout the course of our class in American history, we'll be watching several different kinds of documentaries. One of the biggest ones that we watched was put together by the History Channel several years ago called America, The Story of Us. It uses actors along with interviews of historians to retell what happened a long time ago. These type of documentaries, again, are summaries of what took place a long time ago in the historical past, but they're based upon the research of these historians. They have gone and looked at the primary accounts from those that lived those events as much as they could, and they've put together a little bit of a consensus. So what do you think are some of the most important characteristics of something that is a secondary source? Three big ones that you can think about could be things that it's like secondhand. I heard it from somewhere else. I wasn't actually there. I may be old, but I was not there in a lot of these events, especially from those that took place 150 years ago. Not that old. It's a summary of what we think took place from that time period. And it comes from examining primary sources. There's evidence to support why historians think these events unfolded the way that they did. So there is evidence to support their conclusions and their summaries of what took place. What are some examples of secondary sources? If you said things like textbooks, biographies, encyclopedias or documentaries, you'd be correct. These are all different kinds of secondary sources that we utilize in an American history study course, or any history study course, to learn more about the past. All of these are secondhand accounts or summaries of things that took place a long time ago. So that's secondary sources. Let's further look at what are known as primary sources. What makes something a primary source? Well, again, if we look at the definition for a primary source, it's a first-hand account or record or evidence about a person, place, object, or an event. It comes from the time period that we're studying. These are from that time period. They were there. I was there. I took place in this event. Some examples, and pretty common examples, would be things like diaries, letters, or journals written from people from that particular time period. Now, how many of you share things on social media like Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram? If you said yes to one or many of these, a lot of these documents in the future might be used by our future historians to learn what life was like in the 21st century. The Library of Congress is actually archiving all the tweets that are being sent out on Twitter and storing them in a large database. And maybe in 50, 100 years, historians might access that database and look at people's tweets of particular events that took place to learn more how people reacted to these time periods. So primary documents don't have to be things from a long time ago. They can be things that took place more recently as well. Historians like looking at first-hand accounts from eyewitnesses, and generally diaries, letters, and journals historically are pretty common ones that people like to look at to kind of get an idea of what people were thinking about, what people were writing about, what they were talking about, to give us a little bit more of a broader understanding of what was going on in that particular time period. Historical documents are also another very common type of primary source document that historians like to look at. They're full of data and information about the people living in that time period. There are many different kinds of historical documents, things like census records that our country takes every 10 years. It gives names of people who are living in a particular place, maybe their occupation, how much education they have. Marriage license can be a very common to look at connection between people who married and their children. Military enlistment or discharge papers if they served in the military, to learn more about different kinds of wars. Tax records, death certificates, and many, many more. This here is an example of a scanned copy of basically an entry data of journal that Lewis and Clark wrote on their way down the Missouri River on their exploration out west. And historians can look at these numbers and see, well, how much did they spend and the different kinds of equipment they brought with them. And that gives us a better understanding of what the exploration was like. What were some things they thought was necessary to survive the trip heading out to the west. Newspapers are also another very, very common primary source document if it's from that time period that we're studying. They like to look at the important news stories of the day, what people were writing about those particular stories, and sometimes it's kind of fun looking back at some of the advertisements to see what things people were purchasing or buying at that time period. This is actually a screenshot taken of the Omaha Daily Bee. This was an early Omaha newspaper that was published on December 23rd, 1890. And we can look at some of the articles in this newspaper to see, well, what were things people were talking about here in Omaha in 1890. And here you can see a carriage, a buggy, that was being sold for about $350. And you can think, how did people travel around the streets of Omaha back in 1890? Did they have automobiles? Did they have cars? Probably not. They probably used horse and buggy at that point in time. Historical photographs are also another very important way of connecting to the past as a primary source. We can, as historians, look at photographs and get things such as hair or clothing styles. We can examine details about people, places, objects, and events if they're taking of a place during a particular event. And it's a specific snapshot of a moment in time in history. This is a photograph taken of an unknown family. We don't know who this family is. It is an African American family who the male in this family served as a Union soldier. So as historians, we can look and say, well, when did African Americans serve in the Army? Did they serve for the Union or the Confederate side? Those are kind of documents that we look at to answer historical questions that we might have about the past. Objects are also another important way for us to better understand about our historical past. There are things such as this corn husk doll. This was a common toy that girls played with on the prairie out in the Midwest in the late 1800s. And of course, you can see these medical tools that were used during the Civil War. And there's some big saws and some big tweezer type of things. And I'm wondering what those may have been used for. So again, we can use those as objects as primary source documents to help us better understand the past. Oral interviews is kind of more of a recent, within the last 100 years or so, a way of kind of having a record of what people know about that time period that we're studying. So oral historical interviews are just people sitting down and asking them questions. You were alive back then. What was it like? And so they can be both audio or video. For example, later this year, you'll have a chance to listen to slave interviews. These were people that were interviewed in their old age in the 1930s, but back in 1860, they were young children and they were still enslaved before the slavery was abolished at the end of the Civil War. And their interviews kind of shed light of what it was like to be a slave in America in the middle 1800s. And they kind of give us kind of a glimpse of what that society was like. So what are some of the important characteristics of something that is a primary source? It's got to be firsthand from somebody that was actually at the event of study, and it lets us see what life was like during that time period. It did give us a better clue of what life was like. What are some examples of primary sources? And again, you might have said things like journals, diaries, letters, historical documents, newspapers, photos, or objects can all be examples of primary sources that can be used to help us better understand the past. I'd like you at this time to go ahead and pause the video, and I would like you to read these 5 examples, and I want you to identify, are these examples of primary sources or secondary sources? So at this time, go ahead and pause the video. Let's see how you did. You read a biography of Alexander Graham Bell written by Edwin S. Grosvenor. Is this a primary or secondary source? Well, since this is not an autobiography, this is just a biography. So someone else wrote this book. It's not Alexander Graham Bell's own writing, it's somebody else. So that would make it a secondary source because it's secondhand. Someone probably did some research on Alexander Graham Bell. You find from the National Archives Albert Einstein's immigration record when he immigrated to the United States. That would be a primary source. That's a document, a record that we have of his immigration to the United States. You are looking at a photo of a 1945 high school football team to see how the sport has changed. This is a photograph, and it's an example of a primary source. And actually, my grandfather is in that photograph. To learn more about World War II, you watch the PBS documentary titled The War. That's got to be a secondary source. It might use some video from World War II, which might kind of be an example of a primary source, but the documentary as a whole, though, is still going to be a secondary source. It's being told by a historian or a documentarian, in this case Ken Burns, where he's kind of summarizing some of the big ideas about World War II. And then last but not least, to learn more about the gold miners in California, you read this 1850 letter written by Beringer. Well, this is written by a 49er, a miner. He was there. So it's got to be a primary source. So I hope you had a good time understanding a little bit about some of the different types of documents that we use in history to better learn about the past. That's what I want you to think as we go throughout the course of the year, that you are going to play the role of historians. You're going to have questions about things that happened in the past and how they connect to our present day. And to find out what happened, you're going to examine both primary sources and secondary sources to find out what took place. So thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions, please make sure you ask your teacher, and I'll see you later.